In this review video, we will be going over factoring. Now, I will write some special factor formulas down, but before we do that, let's just do a couple examples of factoring. This is essentially kind of going backwards from what we did in the previous video, which was, of course, multiplying polynomials out. Let's just go ahead and get started here with a relatively straightforward one here. So let's look at x squared plus x minus 2. And we want to factor this. Now, if you want to remember here, this is going to factor into two terms here. And one of the ways you can kind of remember this is just always checking your answer with FOIL. But what we have here is we've got x squared is my highest term. So what that means is that you would have an x here and an x here as well, because x times x is x squared. Now, of course, we have to figure out what numbers here, like plus 2, minus 1, plus 1, minus 2, which ones we should use. And remember, what you want to say is that we want to always keep in mind what it is that we're getting here. So the numbers have to multiply to negative 2. So if the numbers have to multiply to negative 2, we have a couple options. We could have negative 2 and 1, or we could have 2 and negative 1. But then we also have to ask ourselves, well, wait, I have to have plus x here. So because of the fact that there's just a 1 in front of the x squared, we can just simply say to ourselves, well, which of these adds to 1? And we can see here, if we do negative 2 plus 1, we get negative 1. And if we do negative 2, I'm sorry, not negative 2, just positive 2. So let me erase that here. Positive 2 minus 1, we get 1. So the one we want to use here is the 2 and negative 1. So this would be x plus 2 and x minus 1. Now again, you can always check your answer with these by multiplying it back out, and I'll do it on this example here. If we multiply this back out, so let me just go ahead and underline, this is our final answer, of course. But if we multiply it back out, you'd have x times x, which is x squared, the outside, which is negative 1 times x, so minus x, the inside, plus 2x, and 2 times negative 1 is minus 2. And then, of course, if you simplify that down, you get x squared plus x minus 2, which is what we originally started with, so we know that we factored correctly. All right, I'll only check my work on one there. On the remaining examples, I won't bother checking my work here. So let's look at another one here. Let's look at s squared minus 5s plus 6. So now again, I have s squared, and so this is going to be s and then an s, and then I have to ask myself, okay, well this time it's a positive 6. Now we have a couple options here. We have to have numbers that multiply to 6, so you could have 1 and 6 multiplies to 6, 2 and 3 multiply to 6, but then we have to also think about negative 1, negative 6, that multiplies to positive 6 as well, or negative 2, negative 3, and that multiplies to positive 6 as well. Now, how do we know which one to use here? Well, first off, notice here that we have a negative. And because it's a negative there, that means we have to have one of these options as far as the options there, because I have to have a negative number, and this is what's going to get me my outside and inside terms. Now, again, we just kind of do the same game here. Well, negative 1 plus negative 6 is negative 7. Well, that's clearly not negative 5. Negative 2 plus negative 3 is, of course, negative 5. So this would factor to s minus 2, s minus 3. Now, one other thing I maybe should point out here, hopefully this is something you should all be aware of and familiar. I don't have to write it as s minus 2 times s minus 3. I could, of course, write it as s minus 3 times s minus 2, and those are exactly the same answer, because multiplication doesn't matter the order you write them in. Okay, now let's look at one that's slightly more challenging, and this is 3x squared minus 5x plus 2. Alright, well this is going to factor, or hopefully it factors. That's what we're trying to do. Now, I am still going to have an x here and an x over here in these spots in the front, but I have 3x squared, so there's a 3 that's sitting in there in front. So, well, if I think about it, 3 is pretty easy. The reason it's pretty easy is there's only one option, 1 times 3. That gets you 3. So we'd have 1x, so I'll just write x here, and then the other one would be 3x. So that's 3x times x, which is then 3x squared. Now I've got minus 5x, so again the options for here, I've got 2. Options for 2 would be 1 and 2, and then negative 1 and negative 2. Now I'm going to write a couple things down here. First off, we should decide whether I should use the positive or the negatives. Because I have minus 5x, I should use the negatives. So I'm going to use negative 1 and negative 2. But the issue is, do I write it as x minus 1 and 3x minus 2? Or do I write it as x minus 2, 3x minus 1? And quite frankly, the easiest way I find to do this is what's called guess and check method. There are other more systematic ways of doing it, but I find guess and check to be, quite frankly, for me, the fastest way to do these. And so if we think about this here, what I have currently written, if I were to do the multiplication, the outside would get me negative x, the inside would be negative 6x. Well, negative x plus negative 6x is negative 7. That's not correct. So that one is clearly not correct, so let's erase that. So it has to be the other one. So it has to be x minus 1, 3x minus 2. Now we can double check. Multiply the outside, you get negative 2x. Multiply the inside, and you get negative 3x. Negative 3x plus negative 2x is negative 5x. Alright, now there is also factor by grouping. I encourage you to review that on your own. I'm not going to go over that. The last thing I'd like to do is look at the special factor formulas. Now, these aren't going to be too surprising, really. The reason they're not too surprising is they're just the reverse of the special products. So, for instance, if we have something that is in the form a squared minus b squared, this is going to factor to a minus b times a plus b. And that just, again, reversing our special product rule. Now, as an example of this, let's look at a quite straightforward one, x squared minus 4. Now, it's not necessary to do this, but can help sometimes. Well, a squared is equal to x squared. So a is simply just equal to x. And then b squared is equal to 4. So b is just equal to 2. And so we would get that this x squared minus 4 is equal to x minus 2, x plus 2. Now you can use this a lot more than you might think. And let's look at one more example here. Let's say we had x squared minus 3. Some people look at this and they don't see a difference of 2 squares. But remember, you can always take square roots of numbers. And so this would factor, if we think about it for a second, as x minus the square root of 3 times x plus the square root of 3. Again, you can FOIL that out to verify. Now, the last two special product rules, I'm going to write them both down, and then we'll probably just do one example because they're essentially the same, is if you have a squared plus 2ab plus b squared, this factors to a plus b squared. Or if you have a squared minus 2ab plus b squared, this factors to a minus b quantity squared. And again, this is just our special products in reverse here. The key thing to notice is, of course, in one case you've got a plus 2ab, and in the other case you got a minus 2ab, and that just affects the answer there. So let's go ahead and look at an example here. Let's look at 9x squared plus 24x plus 16. And we want to factor this. Well, first off, we're clearly in the first form, or I should say that's going to be the one we're in. We have to verify that we're in that form, but we know it has to be that one if we're in either of these two because everything's adding. There's no subtraction, so it has to be that first one. All right, but then again, I'm going to kind of write off maybe to the side here. If it was this case, we'd have a squared is equal to 9x squared. So that means a is simply just 3x. B squared would be equal to 16, which means b would be 4. And then what we need to make sure is that I have 2ab sitting there. So what is 2ab? 2ab would be, of course, 2 times 3x times 4, which is just 24x, which is exactly what we have in the middle there. So this just factors to, we can use that special factoring, which this factors to 3x plus 4 quantity squared. So I encourage you to make sure to review factoring, looking in your textbook, review some factoring problems. Factoring is going to become a very important concept in this course as well as in other courses as well.